Camilla's pattern of weaponizing the press against members of the royal family is nothing new. It is a well-documented, decades-long strategy that dates back to the early 1980s, when she was already cultivating close relationships with tabloid insiders and feeding them carefully selected information about the royal household. Her ties to Fleet Street ran deep, and it was those very connections she later exploited to systematically brief against Princess Diana, helping to shape a narrative that served her own ambitions. Fast forward to the period between 2015 and 2017, and the same playbook was in full effect, this time directed squarely at Prince William, Kate, and even Kate's mother, Carol Middleton. When it became publicly known that Charles had gone months without seeing his grandson Prince George, William reportedly complained that his father was perpetually occupied with Camilla's grandchildren. Rather than addressing the issue quietly, Camilla went on the offensive. She began leaking stories to the press portraying Carol Middleton as possessive and controlling, allegedly blocking Charles from accessing George, a calculated smear designed to deflect blame and isolate Kate's family. Simultaneously, stories began appearing in the papers attacking William and Kate as lazy and disengaged, a narrative that flooded the tabloids with striking consistency during that era. Anyone paying attention could see the fingerprints all over it. And now, looking at what is happening once again within the royal family, the pattern is unmistakably the same. Camilla's press machine has simply found new targets. Camilla's war on the royals, a pattern of press manipulation. To understand the current wave of damaging leaks targeting Prince William, Princess Kate, and Prince Harry, one must first look back at the well-documented history of Camilla's relationship with the British press, a relationship that long predates her formal role within the royal family. Camilla's pattern of briefing against Princess Diana is perhaps the most notorious chapter of this history, with numerous royal insiders and journalists having acknowledged over the years that damaging stories about Diana were regularly fed to sympathetic tabloid contacts. This was not an isolated habit, but rather the continuation of a much older arrangement. As far back as the early 1980s, Camilla had cultivated strong and mutually beneficial ties with key figures in the British tabloid press, using those connections to leak information about the inner workings of the royal family. These were not casual acquaintanceships, they were strategic alliances, carefully maintained friendships with journalists and editors who could be trusted to run a story favorably, frame a narrative precisely, or bury an inconvenient truth. The infrastructure of those press relationships, built quietly over decades, would later prove to be a powerful weapon whenever Camilla found herself in conflict with those around her. Camilla's media war, the systematic campaign against the royals. The tensions between Camilla and the Wales camp reached a particularly explosive peak during the 2015 to 2017 period, when a full-scale media conflict erupted over something deeply personal: access to Prince George. At the heart of the dispute was a striking and troubling pattern. Charles had reportedly gone months without seeing his grandson, a situation that Prince William found not just painful, but deeply telling. William's frustration boiled over into complaints that his father was consistently prioritizing time with Camilla's grandchildren over his own, a grievance that spoke volumes about where Charles's loyalties, or at least his diary, truly lay. Rather than address the matter quietly, Camilla allegedly went on the offensive, and the tabloids became her chosen battlefield. Stories began circulating with suspicious regularity, painting Carol Middleton as possessive and controlling, supposedly the real reason Charles was being denied access to George, a narrative that conveniently deflected blame entirely away from Camilla and Charles. Alongside this, a steady drumbeat of stories portraying William and Kate as work-shy and disengaged began filling column inches, a characterization that felt far too coordinated to be coincidental. The press coverage during this period was relentless and impossible to ignore, dominating royal reporting for the better part of 2 years, and those familiar with Camilla's long-established relationships within the British tabloid world, relationships that dated back to her calculated briefings against Diana in the 1980s, recognized the fingerprints immediately. Camilla's long war against Kate Middleton and the Middleton family was, honestly, relentless, calculated, and very much in keeping with a pattern of behavior she had refined over decades. Around 2015 to 2017, the British tabloids were just flooded with a steady drip of damaging stories, portraying William and Kate as idle and reluctant in their royal duties, a narrative that, conveniently, deflected attention away from Camilla herself and, landed squarely on the shoulders of the younger, more popular couple. When it emerged that Prince Charles had gone months without seeing his grandson Prince George, a situation William directly attributed to his father's preoccupation with Camilla's own grandchildren, Camilla reportedly launched into full offensive mode. Rather than address the legitimate grievance, she turned the story on its head, briefing her well-placed tabloid allies that it was, in fact, Carol Middleton who was the problem, painting Kate's mother as an overbearing, possessive gatekeeper who was deliberately keeping George away from his paternal grandfather. It was, honestly, a masterclass in deflection and reputational warfare. On top of that, Kate and William found themselves quietly but conspicuously excluded from royal invitations and events, a social snubbing that carried its own unmistakable message about who held influence in the household. For anyone paying attention, the fingerprints were unmistakable. This was the same woman who had cultivated deep, personal relationships within the press since the early 1980s, and who had used those connections to devastating effect against Princess Diana. Nothing, it seems, had changed. Camilla's press war, the calculated campaign against the Waleses, was something else. The information warfare waged against William, Kate, and the Middleton family was anything but accidental. It was a deliberate, sustained operation rooted in decades of practiced media manipulation. Strategic briefings to carefully cultivated tabloid contacts became Camilla's weapon of choice, with trusted press allies receiving carefully packaged narratives designed to do maximum damage. When it emerged that Charles had gone months without seeing his own grandson Prince George, while seemingly finding ample time for Camilla's grandchildren, William's quiet frustration became ammunition. Rather than addressing the legitimate grievance, the machine swung into action, and suddenly the papers were filled with whispers that Carol Middleton was possessive, controlling, and actively blocking Charles's access to George. It was a masterclass in projection, transforming the aggrieved party into the villain. The attacks broadened further, with William and Kate routinely painted as idle and work-shy across the tabloid pages throughout 2015 to 2017, the stories appearing with the kind of regularity that only a well-placed and highly motivated source could sustain. This was not gossip. This was the media weaponized as an instrument of family warfare, a tactic Camilla had honed long before the Waleses were even a consideration, stretching back to calculated briefings against Diana and cozy press relationships cultivated as far back as the early 1980s. The pattern was unmistakable then, and it remains unmistakable now. The estrangement between Charles and his grandson Prince George during the 2015 to 2017 period was striking enough to raise eyebrows even among those inclined to give the royal family the benefit of the doubt. Charles went months without seeing George, and when William raised the issue, pointing out that his father seemed perpetually occupied with Camilla's own grandchildren, the response from Camilla's camp was swift and calculated. Rather than any acknowledgement or course correction, what followed was a coordinated press offensive. Stories began appearing in the tabloids suggesting that Carol Middleton was the real obstacle, that she was possessive of George and was somehow blocking Charles from having access to his grandson. It was a brazen reversal of reality, and it had Camilla's fingerprints all over it. The grandfather-grandson bond that might have flourished was quietly suffocated, not by distance or scheduling, but by Camilla's deliberate management of Charles's time and priorities, ensuring that her family came first, while the narrative in the press pointed blame firmly in another direction. This was the same playbook she had used against Diana, the same network of well-placed friends in the tabloids she had cultivated since the early 1980s, and it worked with chilling efficiency once again. Central to understanding how these smear campaigns were orchestrated so effectively is Camilla's deeply entrenched network of media contacts, a web of relationships she had been carefully cultivating since the early 1980s. Her connections to tabloid editors and journalists were not casual acquaintances, but rather established alliances, forged over decades of mutual benefit. She supplied the stories, and they supplied the headlines. This gave her a remarkable and, honestly, dangerous ability to plant narratives, shape public perception, and direct the media's gaze precisely where she wanted it, whether that meant painting Carol Middleton as an overbearing grandmother blocking Charles's access to Prince George, or framing William and Kate as work-shy royals failing in their duties. The stories didn't just appear by accident, they were placed, timed, and crafted with intent. What made it all the more insidious was that her access to these press channels never truly dried up. It remained ongoing, reliable, and operational, a private pipeline running quietly beneath the surface of official palace communications. The pattern visible in the 2015 to 2017 period, when barely a week passed without some damaging story about the Waleses splashed across the tabloids, was not a coincidence or a media frenzy born of nothing. It was, by all credible accounts, the same playbook she had run against Diana, simply updated for a new generation of targets. The parallels between what unfolded during the 2015 to 2017 period and what is happening now are impossible to ignore, and anyone paying close attention can see the same fingerprints all over again. Back then, when it became public that Charles had gone months without seeing his own grandson Prince George, William reportedly made his frustration known, pointing out that his father always seemed to find time for Camilla's grandchildren, while his own were deprioritized. Camilla's response was swift and characteristically calculated. She turned the press guns on Kate and her family, orchestrating a coordinated campaign that saw the Middletons suddenly frozen out of invitations while tabloid stories began circulating painting Carol Middleton as possessive and controlling, supposedly blocking Charles from accessing George. Simultaneously, William and Kate found themselves being openly characterized in the press as lazy and entitled, stories that ran consistently across multiple outlets for months. This was not coincidence. This was a campaign, and it had Camilla's hallmarks all over it. She has maintained deep, cultivated relationships with the tabloid press stretching back to the early 1980s, when she was reportedly feeding information about the royal family to journalists, long before her infamous briefings against Princess Diana became part of the historical record. Those press connections never went away. They were simply waiting to be activated again. What we are witnessing now is the same cyclical machine switching back on. The same tactics, the same targets, the same playbook, same. Tabloid journalism played an absolutely central role in amplifying and weaponizing the damaging narratives that circulated against William, Kate, and their family during this period, with media outlets acting less as neutral reporters and more as willing accomplices in spreading selectively leaked information. The sensationalism surrounding royal family disputes was, of course, irresistible fodder for the British press, and stories painting Carol Middleton as a possessive, access-blocking grandmother, or William and Kate as work-shy and lazy, were plastered across front pages with gleeful regularity throughout 2015 to 2017. These outlets provided a ready-made platform for character attacks that were carefully constructed and strategically timed, and it was no coincidence that the stories followed such a consistent and recognizable pattern. Camilla's long-standing and well-documented relationships within the tabloid world, relationships that stretch back to the early 1980s when she was known to brief journalists with information about the royal family, and which deepened through years of coordinated efforts to shape narratives against Princess Diana, meant she had both the connections and the experience to know exactly how to use the press as a weapon. The same fingerprints, the same methods, the same sources whispering into the same friendly ears. The pattern then is unmistakably the pattern now. Camilla's media war, a pattern of leaking and manipulation against the royals. The long-term damage inflicted on the royal family through years of calculated leaking and behind-the-scenes manipulation has left relationships between key members fractured in ways that are difficult to fully repair. The tensions between Charles, William, and Harry that simmered so visibly during the 2015 to 2017 period did not simply evaporate. They calcified into deep-seated mistrust, with family members left quietly wondering who was feeding damaging stories to the press and why. When William felt compelled to voice his frustration over Charles spending more time with Camilla's grandchildren than with his own grandson Prince George, it exposed a rift that went far beyond scheduling conflicts. It revealed an institution slowly being reshaped around one woman's priorities and alliances. The erosion of trust that followed, with Carol Middleton falsely painted as a possessive gatekeeper, and William and Kate branded as lazy by briefings that everyone in royal circles knew had a familiar source, made genuine family closeness almost impossible to sustain. What had been a family navigating the usual complexities of royal life became something far more guarded and transactional, with members weighing every interaction against the backdrop of knowing that Camilla's extensive tabloid contacts meant that private grievances could become tomorrow's front-page headlines. The same pattern playing out again today is not a coincidence. It is a continuation of a decades-long strategy.